Our next topic is the physical examination of the abdomen. And as usual, we're going to quickly review the anatomy and physiology. Then we're going to learn about the common things you asked for during history taking. And then we're going to proceed to physical examination. The physical examination, we're going to talk about common differentials. And as usual, we're going to tackle quickly some of the health promotion topics. So the abdomen refers to the area bounded superiorly by the xiphoid process, inferiorly by the iliac crest, and the anterior superior iliac spine, the pubic tubercle, and the symphysis pubis. So traditionally, it's divided into four quadrants and nine sections. So the four quadrants are the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. So it's important to remember which of the organs are underlying in each quadrant. Alternatively, the abdomen may also be divided into nine sections: the epigastric region, the right and left hypochondriac region, the umbilical area, the right and left lumbar area, and the hypogastric or suprapubic area, as well as the right and left iliac area. The abdominopelvic cavity is located between the thoracic and pelvic diaphragms. It houses most of our digestive organs, the spleen, as well as parts of the urogenital system. It's enclosed by a multi-layered wall of muscles and tendons. The parietal and visceral peritoneum line this cavity and fold over the organs. Okay, so the location of the complaint is going to give us a clue as to the organ involved. For example, if the pain is epigastric in location, then it's going to be localized to the four gut derivatives, such as the stomach, the duodenum, as well as the pancreas. In contrast, if it's in the right upper quadrant, it may be localized to the liver as well as to the hepatobiliary tree. If it's periumbilical, that's going to be derived from the midgut derivatives such as the small intestine, the ileum and the jejunum, the appendix, the ileocecal area, as well as the proximal colon, specifically the ascending colon, as well as the proximal two-thirds of the transverse colon. If it's located hypogastrically, then it's going to be localized to the hindgut derivatives such as the colon, etc. Descending colon, distal one-third of the transverse colon, etc. Or it could be from the urogenital structures such as the bladder, and among females, it could be localized to the uterus. This table just summarizes what I have said in the earlier part of the discussion. So the RUQ, the right upper quadrant, contains the liver and the gallbladder. While for the left, we have the spleen. The left lower quadrant, we have the sigmoid colon, while for the right lower quadrant, we have the appendix. So which structures are actually palpable in each quadrant? In the right upper quadrant, sometimes you could palpate the liver edge near the right costal margin or the border of your ribs. The gallbladder and the duodenum are generally not palpable. And if you have a very thin patient, then the lower pole of the right kidney, which is a retroperitoneal organ, could sometimes even be felt. In contrast, in the left upper quadrant, sometimes could palpate the splenic tip below the left costal margin. It's going to be palpable among patients with splenomegaly or enlargement of the spleen. However, take note that if you're suspecting splenomegaly, then you should avoid deep palpation because the spleen is actually prone to rupture, especially if the patient, for example, has a lymphoma, right? Um, the pancreas are usually, again, not palpable because it is largely retroperitoneal in location, specifically the body and the tail. Now, how about the lower half of the abdomen? For the left lower quadrant, sometimes the tubular sigmoid colon can be palpated. Okay? While for the right lower quadrant, there that location is where you're going to palpate for the appendix. However, in normal people, these are not palpable. Okay. It's important to remember which organs are located retroperitoneally, meaning located behind the peritoneum, meaning attached to the posterior wall. And most famously, the kidneys are retroperitoneal. That's why when you're examining this organ, you look into the costovertebral angle or CVA. So, for example, those with urinary tract infections which are ascending, those with acute pyelonephritis are said to have costovertebral angle tenderness, right? Aside from the retroperitoneal organs, it's also important to note which are located in the pelvic cavity. Take note that the pelvic cavity is actually continuous with abdominal cavity. The pelvic cavity contains the ureter, the bladder, pelvic genital organs, and sometimes loops of the intestine. Okay? The bladder is a hollow reservoir that accommodates around 400 to 500 ml of urine. The, it involves voluntary control by the higher brain centers. Sometimes, for example, those with prostatic disease, in which there is urinary retention, sometimes they could have a very distended bladder, and sometimes it could be palpable above the symphysis pubis. So we could group the complaints for the abdominal system into the gastrointestinal disorders and the urinary or renal disorders. So for the gastrointestinal disorders, we could have the following. And we're going to discuss each of them in turn, starting with abdominal pain. Abdominal pain could be either visceral or parietal. Okay, so if you remember the anatomy of the neural structures for the hollow organs, they are more difficult to localize. So they are vague in nature. So if you ask the patient, where's the pain, and they are unable to point towards a specific area, they're saying it's just a general area, then it's more of a visceral pain. Aside from that, in terms of character, it's more knowing, burning, or aching, less of a stabbing nature. Okay, so visceral pain could be seen, for example, in early appendicitis, in which the peritoneum is not yet involved. In contrast with parietal pain, it originates from an inflammation of the parietal peritoneum. And in terms of character, it's more of a steady aching pain, more severe, and the patient could point to it. Aside from that, another characteristic of parietal pain is that it's aggravated by movement. There's also referred pain in the abdomen. Referred, meaning it's felt in a is in a site which is distant from the involved location. Okay? Referred pain occurs because that area is innervated by a similar spinal level. So it develops as initial pain intensifies. For example, if you have a right biliary tree pain, it could eventually be referred to the right shoulder. So if your patient complains of the following symptoms, then these are localized to the upper abdomen. So the most common causes would be dyspepsia or gastroesophageal reflux disease. Dyspepsia is a relatively vague diagnosis. It's a chronic or recurrent pain or discomfort in the upper abdomen. In contrast, gastroesophageal reflux disease is diagnosed with more than 90% accuracy. The patient reports heartburn and regurgitation together more than once a week. So it's heartburn, meaning the location is not just epigastric, sometimes it moves substernally. So it's sometimes confused with chest pain. While regurgitation is the sensation of something rising up from the abdomen towards the chest. If your patient complains of any of these symptoms, then you need to rule out certain alarm symptoms. These are called alarm symptoms because they may be clues to greater or more severe conditions. These include dysphagia or difficulty swallowing, odynophagia or pain while swallowing, recurrent vomiting, evidence of gastrointestinal bleeding, early satiety, meaning they're already full after several bites of their food, weight loss, anemia, palpable mass, or painless jaundice. Why? It's because all of these alarm symptoms could point towards a tumor or a mass. So patients with alarm symptoms, those aged more than 55 years old, or those who have failed empiric therapy, for example, using beta blockers, uh, uh, omeprazole, for example, or H2 blockers, may warrant further endoscopy. How about if the pain is localized to the lower abdomen? Here you need to note the location and the character of the pain because these are key to diagnosis. Always ask the patient to point to the pain. So in the right lower quadrant, if it's pain that migrates from the periumbilical region combined with abdominal wall rigidity, suggesting involvement of the parietal peritoneum, then this is suspicious for appendicitis. Among women, you need to consider certain gynecologic diagnoses such as pelvic inflammatory disease, a ruptured ovarian follicle, as well as ectopic pregnancy. In contrast, for left lower quadrant lesions or problems, pain, especially with the palpable mass, could signal diverticulitis, for example, in the sigmoid colon. Okay? While cramping radiating to the left lower quadrant could also be a renal stone. During history taking, what other symptoms could our patient complain of? You could also complain of dysphagia or difficulty swallowing. As I have mentioned, this is a red flag. So it suggests a structural issue. For solids and liquids, it's a motility disorder. We need to always ask about any changes in bowel habits, including frequency, consistency, and color. So for bowel function, it may be diarrhea or constipation. Diarrhea is loose watery stools more than 75% of the time, while constipation is less than 3 bowel movements per week with straining or incomplete evacuation. If the patient complains of a thin pencil-like stool, it could be indicative of an obstructing lesion, such as a fungating mass in the on the left side of the colon. Okay? Jaundice is a yellowish discoloration coming from increased bilirubin. Mechanisms include increased production, decreased hepatic uptake, decreased conjugation, or decreased excretion, while a dark urine could indicate impaired bilirubin excretion as well. Now let's move on to health promotion advice, starting with alcohol abuse. So maybe you're familiar with the advice, drink moderately. But what's moderate? For men, it's less than or equal to 2 drinks per day, while for women, moderate drinking is less than or equal to 1 drink per day. And the drink is different. Depending on the type of alcoholic beverage. So, for example, if it's beer, just one bottle. If it's vodka or something more concentrated, then it's one shot. If it's wine, it's one glass. Next, we should also advise our patient for awareness regarding viral hepatitis. So, there are vaccines for hepatitis B, and they are very important. So, hepatitis A is transmitted via fecal oral route. So, for this, you need to prevent this by doing hand washing. Aside from that, we could also advise the patient to avoid eating street food. Okay? In contrast, hepatitis B and hepatitis C are both blood-borne diseases. Hepatitis B is serious. It can become chronic and lead to cirrhosis or liver cancer. Therefore, universal vaccination for all infants is recommended. Unfortunately, for hepatitis C, no vaccine exists. So the prevention is still prevention of blood-borne transmission. For example, no sharing of needles for injecting drug users. And lastly, for health promotion, we have colorectal cancer. The strongest risk factors for colorectal cancer include age, a personal history of colorectal cancer or polyps, inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's disease, and family history. Weaker factors include male sex, tobacco or alcohol use, and obesity. So here are the screening recommendations generally for most adults. From ages 50 to 75, we recommend high sensitivity fecal occult blood testing annually. Or alternatively, you may do sigmoidoscopy every 5 years. Or if you combine sigmoidoscopy with FOBT, you can do it every 3 years. Colonoscopy is most thorough, so you could do colonoscopy just every 10 years. Beyond that age, screening is no longer routinely recommended because typically there's already poor prognosis for surgery. So even if you're able to diagnose the patient of colorectal cancer, it's very unlikely that they're still going to operate on them. So how do we do? Physical examination. This is the meat now of our lecture. So before doing the examination, we ensure that the patient has an empty bladder. Also, make sure that the patient is comfortable in the supine position. Expose just the abdomen, just above the xiphoid to the symphysis pubis. Remember, in physical examination, just expose the area that is of our concern. Then we warm our hands and our stethoscope, especially if the aircon or if the air conditioning is cold. And of course, we should examine the painful areas last. And some of our patients may be very compliant to their doctors, and so we should be more sensitive. We should observe the patient's face for any signs of discomfort. So if you see already see in the patient's face that it is uncomfortable, then we should not probe further. All right. So unlike the other portions of the physical examination in which we do inspection, palpation, percussion, and then auscultation, in the abdominal examination, we have a different order. We do inspection followed by auscultation, and then percussion and palpation. Okay? So for inspection, we start from the patient's right side and then inspect the abdomen surface, contours, and movements. We note if there are any skin lesions such as scars, striae, or dilated veins. Dilated veins such as caput medusae could be seen among patients um, with chronic liver disease. Striae, on the other hand, could be seen among those with Cushing syndrome. Of course, you could see scars if the patient has surgery beforehand. Should also note the umbilicus, the contour if it's flat, rounded, protuberant, or scaphoid. Scaphoid means boat like, meaning it's the patient is very thin, for example, right? There's also a difference between rounded and protuberant. If protuberant, it means that it is um, bulging unexpectedly compared to the patient's entire habitus. Meaning, for example, if a very thin patient and their abdomen is the one that's only very big, then that could be described as protuberant. Okay. You should also note the symmetry and any visible peristalsis or pulsations. Why do we perform auscultation before percussion and palpation? Because auscultation could alter the bowel sounds. Okay, so what are you listening for in the auscultation portion? We're listening for vowel sounds, and normal vowel sounds would have clicks and gurgles around 5 to 34 per minute. So if it's increased, it may be indicative of diarrhea. If it's decreased or even absent, it may be a functional obstruction, for example, ileus. You should listen also over the vascular system. So sometimes you could hear bruit over the aorta, the renal, iliac, and femoral arteries. In this case, this would suggest vascular occlusive disease, for example, in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. For percussion, you should percuss over all four quadrants. So you should assess the distribution of tympani. So where are you expecting tympani? You're going to expect tympani over the gastric bubble, of course, and dullness over areas of fluid or feces. Dullness can indicate an enlarged organ, a mass, or a distended bladder. And if there is any dullness in the flanks, this may be suggestive of ascites or fluid that has escaped the peritoneal area. For palpation, you could divide it between light and deep palpation. You start with light palpation. In light palpation, you check for tenderness, resistance, and superficial organs. For deep palpation, you do it to delineate the liver edge, the kidney, and abdominal masses, noting their location, size, shape, consistency, and tenderness. So, for example, if a patient has cirrhosis and the liver has already become nodular due to cycles of damage and restructuring or remodeling, then the leverage is going to be irregular, right? So it's important in the physical examination of the abdomen to differentiate between acute abdomen. Acute abdomen requires acute measures. It's also known as the surgical abdomen, meaning it already requires intervention surgically. So what you're looking for when you're assessing for acute abdomen is the involvement of the peritoneum. So the peritoneum could be irritated by anything that has damaged the gut, for example, and has therefore led to accumulation of fluid, blood, pus, or any other irritating thing into the peritoneum. Okay. So for example, in appendicitis, if the patient has acute abdomen, then they're going to test for the following things. So, what are those signs? These signs include the cough test. You ask the patient to cough and identify where it produces pain. Remember, if it's colicky pain, it's going to be vague. But if the peritoneum is involved, it's going to be sharper and could be more directly localized. Next would be guarding or voluntary contraction of the abdominal wall. Next is rigidity, which is involuntary reflex contraction. Rebound tenderness is pain expressed after the examiner quickly removes a hand pressed over the tender area, while percussion tenderness is pain elicited by gentle percussion. Overall, it just means that if you have peritonitis, it's going to be more sensitive and more localized because of the involvement of the peritoneum. Okay, before we end, um, let's look into the special techniques as well as the organ-specific findings. So, for the organ-specific examination, for example, in the liver, if you're suspecting that the patient has a liver condition, such as cirrhosis, you percuss the vertical span of liver dullness in the right midclavicular line. So, the normal span is going to vary depending on the patient. Then you palpate the liver edge by placing your hand right below the border of dullness and pressing it in and up as the patient takes a deep breath. Okay. In contrast, for the spleen, you check for it in the left upper quadrant, right? So an enlarged spleen is going to expand anteriorly, downwardly, and medially. So for this, you percuss what's called the Traub space. The Traub space is located in the left lower anterior chest wall, and you need to percuss for it for dullness. Okay? You could also check for the splenic percussion sign. Palpate below the left costal margin, pressing in toward the spleen as the patient takes a deep breath. Next, let's move to the kidneys and the aorta. I would like you to remember that the kidneys are located retroperitoneally, and as such, they are not usually palpable. If you want to check whether they are palpable, you could use one hand to lift from the back while the other feels deeply in the upper quadrant. You should also assess again for costovertebral angular tenderness with fist percussion over this area. So if it's positive, then there may be ascending infection of the urinary tract. Lastly, for the aorta, you press firmly deep into the epigastrium, slightly left of midline to identify any aortic pulsations. So among adults aged 50 years old and above, you need to assess the width by pressing with one hand on each side. A normal aorta should not be more than 3 centimeters wide. And if you have an expansile mass 3 centimeters or larger, this is suggestive of a vascular condition called abdominal aortic aneurysm. And finally, we have special techniques for different conditions such as ascites, appendicitis, and acute cholecystitis. Okay, what's ascites? Ascites is fluid in the abdomen, okay, in the potential space of the abdomen. So you're going to suspect ascites if the patient has a protuberant abdomen with bulging flanks. There are two tests that you could do for ascites: shifting dullness and the fluid wave test. You do shifting dullness, you test for shifting dullness by percussing the borders with the patient's supine and then roll to the side. If there's fluid, it's going to shift or move to the more dependent portion. In other words, while the patient is supine, there may be dullness, but when you move the patient to one side or the other, then there's going to be less dullness because the fluid has shifted downwards. Right? Next is fluid wave test. A fluid wave test is done by tapping one flank while feeling for an impulse on the opposite flank. Okay. For appendicitis, there are many named tests. Um, but for now, I'm going to introduce you some of the more common ones. You check for pain at the McBurney's point. It's somewhere midway or one third of the way from the umbilicus to the anterior superior iliac spine on the right. Okay. A patient may also have a positive Rovsing sign. Rovsing sign happens when the patient experiences a right lower quadrant pain when you apply or the examiner applies a left lower quadrant pressure. So take note, you apply pressure on the left side, but the patient feels the pressure or the pain on the right side, right? So a sign on the other hand is pain with hip flexion, while the obturator sign is pain with internal hip rotation. Now all of these signs could increase the likelihood of appendicitis. And lastly, we have acute cholecystitis. Acute cholecystitis is simply inflammation of the gallbladder. You need to check for the Murphy sign. Murphy sign is a sharp increase in tenderness with a halt in inspiration when palpating under the right costal margin. So in other words, you place your hand over the right costal margin, the border of the ribs on the right side of the patient, and then you ask them to inhale. And if the patient suddenly stops inhaling because of a pain, then that is what we call acute cholecystitis. This sign alone triples the likelihood of having acute cholecystitis. And that's it. But before we finish, let's try to learn how to record the findings. Normally, you're going to write something like this. The abdomen is protuberant or scaphoid or whatever with active bowel sounds. It is soft and non-tender. There are no palpable masses or hepatosplenomegaly. Liver span is around 7 centimeters at the right midclavicular line. The edge is smooth and palpable 1 centimeters below the right costal margin. The spleen and kidneys were not felt. There is no costovertebral angle tenderness. But what if the patient, for example, has an acute abdomen or a surgical abdomen, what we call peritonitis? Then you're going to write something like this. The abdomen is flat. No bowel sounds are heard. It is firm and board-like. That's because of rigidity, with decreased tenderness, guarding, and rebound in the right lower quadrant. The liver percusses to 7 centimeters in the midclavicular line. The edge is not felt, spleen and kidney is not felt, and no CVA tenderness. Right? That's it for the physical examination of the abdomen. In order to better visualize, I have assigned to you some videos for watching. And if you have any questions, as always, don't forget to message me. Thank you very much, everyone. That's it for our lecture.